I'm Jim Csek. You're watching Kelowna Now. Today I have with me Mario Canseco of Research Polls. And the polls seem to matter right now. So we've seen the BC United fold their party just a couple of days ago and fold into the BC Conservative Party. And I believe polls probably had a lot to do with that. What do you think, Mario?
I think it was remarkable to be able to measure something that hasn't happened in Canadian politics in a long time. You know, we had the opportunity to look into the race right after Kevin Falcon became leader of the BC Liberals. They were a very competitive party at that point in time. Then the rebrand happened, and we start to see the numbers getting a little bit lower than what Andrew Wilkinson had in 2020. At the same time, we start to have the rise of the Conservatives. In September, they were essentially tied, one at 20%, one at 19%. And the line just kept growing for the Conservatives to the point of getting within 3 percentage points of the NDP in the last survey we conducted in late July. And at the same time, BC United dropping to single digits. So a lot of what we see is definitely something that was happening at a slow pace, but at a very certain pace when it came to what the vehicle for change would be for voters who are dissatisfied with the NDP. The assumption was Kevin Falcon is going to bring back that BC Liberal magic and have the ability to have this coalition work together. But ultimately, it's going to be John Rostad, who is the de facto holder of the banner of the free enterprise movement in 2024.
Yeah, it seemed like a meteoric rise for the Conservatives and just like a free fall as it progressed for the BC United. And I imagine there's people in the back rooms there, especially the people funding these campaigns, that are saying like this is just kind of a disaster. And I'm sure the NDP were kind of rubbing their hands together and say they'll just split the vote on the right and this will be an easy election for them. And the news came as quite a shock this late into the process, I guess, right? 6 weeks out. And then I guess everybody would be scrambling at this point because we have a legitimate race right now.
Well, I think it was developing for the past few months. You know, back in July, having the NDP at 41%, which is usually the level that they have in elections. You know, you go back to 2005, 2009, even 2013, there's around 41% of people who usually vote for the NDP. The election of 2020 was a rarity because the pandemic made a lot of people who usually don't support the NDP vote for their candidates because they were happy with the pandemic management. That's how they got to 48%. So to have them at 41 is okay. Your base of support is there. You could get a little more and then get a few more seats now in specific areas. But the Conservatives at 38 is significantly higher than what Andrew Wilkinson got in the last election, leading the BC Liberals. And I think the two-horse race was already developing before Kevin Falcon decided that he didn't want to do this anymore. It's going to be very interesting to watch what happens, particularly in the Okanagan. You know, we have an area that has been traditionally BC Liberal. There were incumbents that up to earlier in the week were defending territory, and the expectation was, from the standpoint of the NDP, you know, people like Peter Milobar or Todd Stone, they could be losing 10 or 15% of their vote share to the Conservatives, and then we can win those seats with 35, 37% of the vote. That's not going to happen anymore. So it's ultimately going to come down to whether the Conservatives can establish an emotional connection and get those seats, do a little bit better in the Fraser Valley, where the NDP won 7 out of 9 seats the last time. And then we have a race. I mean, ultimately, the largest number of seats is in Metro Vancouver. There might be an opportunity to connect for the Conservatives in this area. But the numbers, if there's a place where they can start to run up the numbers and be more competitive, it definitely starts in the Okanagan and the Fraser Valley.
So Kevin Falcon had stated a number of times, I interviewed him as well, and he stated that polls don't matter, that people just, you know, they just don't know who they're voting for at this point. But obviously polls did matter, and it really changed like you said, this is kind of an unusual circumstance, and then one we haven't seen for a long time where a party basically disbands and joins the other party. I would say a lot of it had to do with the polls.
And I would say so too. I think it was a little bit misguided to always point at the example of 2013 as a way to essentially say that public opinion surveys don't matter. We've had elections in British Columbia after that in 2017 and in 2020. We've had elections in other parts of the world where the situation works. Part of this is a fundamentally flawed analysis of what happened in 2016 in the United States. You know, we didn't have a lot of data coming out of places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, or Wisconsin in the final week of the campaign to figure out if Trump was going to carry those states. The surveys at the national level, including one that I conducted, suggested that Trump was going to lose the popular vote, and that is exactly what happened. But you have a lot of people who look at that example, who look at Brexit, for instance, where you have several pollsters who said it could be won, several that said it was a tie, several that said it could be a loss, and to essentially blanket everybody under the same idea that surveys don't matter. We saw the sound bites going out of Kevin Falcon, essentially saying, I'm getting a great response at the door. If that were the case, he wouldn't have quit on Wednesday.
Yeah, so maybe you could explain a little bit of the magic that goes into polls, because I know you have a test kind of sample audience, and we, as publishing news, we get a lot of, sometimes flack for when we publish a poll and they say, oh, you're only interviewing a few people and these polls don't matter. And, they always say it doesn't matter. But stats kind of work though, right? So maybe just explain a little of that magic.
Well, essentially what we do is try to recreate the population that you're conducting your survey on. And this means looking at the census targets. If you're doing something that's Canada-wide, for instance, you got to have the right mix of genders, the right mix of ages. For instance, in a survey of 1,000 people, you'll have about 300 and something coming out of Ontario, about 250 coming out of Quebec, about 150 British Columbians, because that is the way in which the population is distributed. If you have the correct sample as far as the age, the gender, and the region, you can have something representative of the entire country, even if you only speak to 1,000 people. Part of what happens is this notion of, no, you need to have a larger sample size. You need to talk to 10,000 people. Statistics don't work that way. You don't need to talk to that many people in order to figure out how they're feeling about a specific issue. When it comes to electoral polls, it gets a little more complicated because in a perfect world, and this is something that my colleagues in Australia enjoy all the time, everybody casts a ballot. In Australia, you get fined if you don't. So everybody you're calling or you're contacting online is a voter. The difficulty in Canada is figuring out who's actually going to cast a ballot. We don't have 100% voter turnouts. We know that there's some groups that vote a little bit more, like the over 55s, but every election is a different animal in that sense. There might be elections where the young people are more motivated to cast a ballot, or where people get dissatisfied with the choices and have a lower voter turnout. Ontario in 2022 was a good example of this because turnout was dismally low. But you had a significant proportion of voters who were very happy with what Doug Ford was doing, and they came out and supported him and gave him a new majority. So that is part of the essence of the argument. Yes, you can talk to a small number of people to try to figure out where they're moving, but the biggest complexity as you get closer to the election is how many of these people are actually going to show up and vote. So it's not a situation where everybody you contact is going to be interested. Sometimes people tell you, I'm not voting, I don't care. Okay, I won't keep asking you questions about this. But it's difficult because every electoral process is going to be different in that sense.
Yeah, stats was my favorite course in college, and because I really believe in. Some people think it's magic, but it's really just math, right? And it's extrapolating a population and doing all those things, and I guess then you have those confidence intervals and how confident are you, and there's that the margin of error and stuff like that. You guys factor that all in. On sentiment, how much of the federal politics has played a part, do you think, in the BC politics with, John Russ said having to have the right logo and then the BC United, being still tied to the Liberal Party, affecting people's decisions?
I think it's immense. There's no other way to describe it. I've followed Canadian elections for a long time. I've polled in elections federally since 2008. And I look at the numbers in British Columbia, the results from the elections, what you're getting from the surveys that I conducted, and you never had the federal Conservatives at the level that Pierre Poilievre has right now in British Columbia. You got to go back to the 2000 election under Stockwell Day to look at British Columbia essentially saying 50% of us are voting for this party. So that tells you all about how massive that pool is. When you have a situation where Pierre Poilievre, who's never been elected to serve as our own head of government, is getting numbers that Stephen Harper couldn't achieve in British Columbia. You
can just see it in the audiences, right? Like, he's got like almost rock star status. He's filling stadiums in that. That alone tells you statistically that there's a message there for people. Do you know what I mean? Like it's tough for politicians to fill stadiums.
Well, and I think what is really remarkable of this, and part of the reason for the numbers to be as high as they are for Pierre Poilievre, is that it's not just the over 55 suddenly coming back to becoming fiscally conservative and looking at things differently and being upset with Trudeau. The level of support he's getting from young people is significantly high. We usually think of young people as more center-left minded, maybe the NDP, maybe the Greens, maybe the Liberals. And right now they're saying the person who is speaking my language when it comes to economic concerns, and particularly housing, which is the number one issue for young people in the country, is the Conservatives. And that is something that we haven't seen before. It's usually this notion of people going from Liberal to Conservative and deciding the government every time it happens, and you still have your pockets of support for the NDP. You have areas in Quebec that are always going to vote for the Bloc. But now you have the Conservatives climbing the charts in Quebec, doing remarkably well in Atlantic Canada, where Trudeau won all the seats in 2015, and at 50% in British Columbia. So it's a significant juggernaut that has to play a role in the way people feel about provincial politics. It's the right kind of brand and the right kind of name and the right kind of color.
Right time, right place.
Of course, you contrast this. Absolutely. Timing is everything in politics. And at the same time, you have somebody coming back after 10 years away from politics, making changes to branding and having two colors instead of one. It wasn't going to be a close race.
Yeah, that seat that the federal Liberals lost in Ontario, that was a Liberal stronghold, is also a very strong message. And I just wonder how that polling will go when they decide that they need to do a leadership change in the Liberal government. Are you tracking any of that stuff right now?
Well, we're looking at the federal numbers, and what's interesting has been the way in which the relationship of Canadians with the deal that Justin Trudeau established with Jagmeet Singh began. It was more like cautious optimism. Okay, 45, 47% thinking, I like where this is going. I think the government is going to deliver some interesting things in this minority because you have a couple of center-left-minded people working together. The problem with pharmacare is everybody had a different idea of what pharmacare would mean to them. And that's a survey that we conducted a few months ago. And everybody thinks what I need is going to be there. And then you look at the pharmacare deal that is significantly limited and isn't actually helping everybody. People feel a little bit dismayed by where it goes. And it's a similar situation with dental care. There's so many people who haven't been touched by this. And this is making Canadians for the first time believe that they haven't really gotten anything remarkable out of the deal that has been established. The approval rating for Trudeau is down. The approval rating for Jagmeet Singh is down. At the same time, 52% of Canadians have a positive opinion of Pierre Poilievre. So you're starting to see those trends developing in a way that suggests that the government will change. Of course, the Liberals have the opportunity to steer policy through, to talk about specific things that they'd like to see happening. But it's getting very difficult right now to assume a situation where there will be a massive change and people will start looking at the government in a positive light. They had the opportunity with pharmacare and with dental care, and their numbers haven't improved.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of people can't even distinguish on a regular day between federal and provincial. They see the logo, like even NDP and Liberal, and say anything but NDP and Liberal at this point. I'm talking nationally. And then all of a sudden, John's riding a rocket ship up with the Conservative logo, and and the BC United is kind of like, who is that? And whereas the NDP logo is obviously associated, and those two parties are associated as well, like the federal NDP and the BC NDP.
Well, and I think this certainly makes things a little bit easier in the rural areas. John is very well known. He's somebody who's campaigned extensively as a BC Liberal member of the Legislative Assembly. I think it'll be interesting to watch how the situation develops with the center-right vote in Metro Vancouver. We're used to having BC Liberal leaders who are based here. Christy Clark, for the latter stages of her premiership, had to run somewhere else because she was defeated in her riding. But you have this traditionally Vancouver-based leader who suddenly becomes the leader of the party and then the head of government. How are the boardrooms going to react with somebody like John Ross?
When was the last time we had a rural premier? Can you remember when we had the last time we had a rural premier?
Not on this century for sure. But I mean, people might say, well, Christy Clark was in Kelowna for the latter stages. That's fine, but a lot of her career was essentially built when she was here. I mean,
she was in Kelowna because they had to fix something, though, right? Because she lost her seat, and that was, it wasn't that she was here to begin with. They came to fix a problem. But a lot of British Columbians believe that the Lower Mainland decides everything, and the rest of BC gets forgotten lots of times too. So I don't know how that's going to play out. I guess the big question I have you done a poll since, or when are you planning to do your next poll since the BC United have become the BC Conservative as well?
There's part of me that goes, do it this weekend, start to figure out what goes on. But I think we need to wait for the dust to settle. I think there's a lot of confusion. People who might have read a story about the two parties working together might be assuming that their candidate from United is now the candidate for the Conservatives, or the other way around. I think there's still a lot of confusion. Apparently, the list of candidates for the Conservatives will be finalized by Labor Day. I think that'll give us an opportunity to say to people, these are the candidates and this is the situation. Because there's also a moving target as far as how many BC United candidates will say, I knocked on a lot of doors and I still want to do this.
Yeah, there's some disenchantment for sure. I've spoke to a few candidates. So some of them may choose to run as independents. And we'll see. I mean, that'll be a big part of what Kevin Falcon and John Rustad can do to kind of like soothe some people's, anxiety and like they put some effort in already too, right? So.
Well, and I think it's something that they're definitely entitled to do. I mean, this is what was so shocking about the announcement. This comes 24 hours after they present their forestry platform. They were still knocking on doors that day. And suddenly you realize that the situation has been suspended. Now, I understand why they use the word suspended, because it's something that is included in most political parties' constitutions. When you have a candidate that goes rogue or does something terrible or was arrested, the prerogative is on the leader to say, you're not running for us anymore. It's not supposed to be used for everybody, which is essentially what happened on Wednesday. Right. And I think that takes a lot of people. It certainly turns some of the candidates off. I mean, if I'm somebody who knocked on doors for BC United, who donated to BC United, who decided to run for BC United, I feel a little bit slighted.
Yeah, I think to see how much magic John Rustad has in the tickle box there to kind of soothe over some feathers, I think, because, that could cause a little, discontentment or split votes still. But is there a lot of sentiment out there that basically people are looking for anything but the NDP on the ballot too? Because I hear that from people.
I think that's definitely part of it. And one of the reasons why this is happening at a rate that is significantly higher than in other elections is David Eby didn't command the party in 2020. What you have is people who were elected under John Horgan in an election that was a rarity because it happened in the middle of the pandemic. Horgan's approval rating when we were heading into that election was 65%. So you're bound to have a situation where you get a lot of people to vote for you. And when you're at that level of support, it means that people who may not vote for you because they don't like the NDP actually like you personally. And that was one of the most interesting findings of that survey, to see people who were going to vote for the Greens or vote for the BC Liberals saying, I respect the Premier, I'm not voting for his candidate, or maybe whoever's running on my riding I don't like, or I want to keep my incumbent MLA who is a BC Liberal or a BC Green. I mean, there's so many reasons for this. But Eby has never led a party in an election. His approval rating is at 48%. It's better when you think about the way in which things are going for other premiers in the country. But it's not enough to solidify something like that. And I think that is going to be the major challenge for the two parties. Neither David Eby nor John Rustad have ever led a campaign of this magnitude. The one with the most experience is Sonia Furstenau now, and they have a decision to make as far as spending their money in a specific place and trying to secure 3 or 4 seats where they're competitive, or trying to run a full slate and say we're the alternative if you're upset with an NDP that is not really doing progressive things in their minds, and a Conservative Party that is too radical on the right.
Sonia's been very vocal of late, and how are they doing? Are they kind of just staying within their kind of like their channel there, or where do you see the BC Greens going?
I think they can hold on to the base of support they have in Southern Vancouver Island. I think one of the seats is probably a little bit safer than the other. The reason, in my estimation, that Sonia chose to run in Victoria is with the way in which the ridings were redistributed. She gets a significant portion of what used to be the Juan de Fuca riding under John Horgan. So you're not starting from a position of strength as far as the level of support that you have, because you're bringing in all of these areas that voted heavily for the NDP. I think there's a chance to connect. And one thing she did very well in 2020 was really take her case to people when it came to the debates, the certain things that she was talking about. I think it helped them keep the level of support that they had under Andrew Weaver. And the fact that there's no BC United Party certainly can cement that. You know, you need to look at the 9% of people who said they're voting BC United. How much of it is animosity towards the two options? How much of it is that you're happy with your incumbent MLA? And you know, if your incumbent MLA is running as a conservative, do you think about it twice? Do you stay with them? If they're not, then what do you do? So it's a small portion of the electorate, but where they go can actually help decide what happens on October 19th.
Some of the NDP MLAs try to paint the John Rustad as an extremist, Trumpian, and you know, all those kind of like ist words and stuff like that. But a lot of his actions of late seem to be moving him towards more to the center, like, you know, adding Eleanor Sturko, you know, even, you know, that progressive Gavin Dew, and then, you know, like bringing in the BC United Party members. I mean, that's more in the center too, right? Does he realize that to win government that you actually have to move more towards the center? Is that, or was he always there?
I think it's part of a concerted effort to appeal to people who maybe haven't made the switch yet. And you're right. I think, you know, the addition of somebody like Gavin Dew certainly helps. You know, he's somebody who's very well liked, somebody who ran for the BC Liberal leadership. You have somebody like Amelia Bultby running in Penticton, #1 council vote getter in the last municipal election. Like, these are the kinds of people that usually sought a nomination with the BC Liberals. And of course, now they see the Conservatives as the vehicle for change and their home in the center right. But there's other issues at play. I mean, there's candidates who were approved by the Conservatives and have been asked to step aside. I'm not sure if that is going to happen with some of the places, in some of the places where you have BC United incumbents who probably have a better chance of winning. And that creates a similar scenario for John Rustad than the one Kevin Falcon is facing. You know, I signed up to run as a Conservative when the party was at 4% in the polls. And now you're asking me to step aside because somebody who's supposedly more attractive became available. It might lead to a lot of confusion down the road, and certainly lead to people being upset. But you know, I think both campaigns have been trying to send the other to the to the furthest edges of the political spectrum. You know, you have the NDP calling them radicals, the Conservatives saying that it's a radical government. Like, everybody's trying to position themselves as the other is the one that is the dangerous option. And emotional connection wins elections. So if Rustad can sell a vision of the province where everything is going to be a little bit better and easier, and you have a better chance of figuring out where you're going and things will be better, then he'll win. If AB says, you know, don't vote for these people because they're going to take us back. And I think that is part of what happened with the Falcon campaign. You know, you're trying to meet everybody in the middle, and it doesn't work that way. You know, you have to appeal to a specific portion of voters in order for you to start to climb the charts.
Yeah, I look at stuff sometimes like a hockey team. You had a team that already had tryouts and they had their picks, and then you had another team that had their tryouts and picks, and all of a sudden there's only one team, and now you got to do tryouts again. And I guess the message that Kevin Falcon was trying to leave his candidates with was that, you know, we have to do what's best for British Columbia. Now it'll be up to them to decide whether or not they'll take that to heart, or if, you know, like they've already put in the work and they want to be on a team, no matter if it's on that team or their own team.
Well, and it's ultimately something that has to do with a decision that is very personal for everybody. You know, we have Karen Kirkpatrick in West Vancouver who says, maybe I'll jump back into the fray because I want to have an option that is not conservative and that is not, you know, the NDP. People who knocked on doors, people who are making the rounds and saying, you know, I think I have a shot at this if I run as an independent or not. But campaigns cost money. There's a lot of complications on doing something like that. I remember the early stages of the Bloc Québécois at the federal level. It was, it started with 4 progressive conservatives who were very upset with Brian Mulroney and said, you know what, we're our own party, and here we are. And people laughed. But in 1993, they formed the official opposition. So there's a way in which these movements can coalesce. And I also think this is one of the reasons why it's too early to be asking about who we're going to vote for. We might have a lot of developments in the next 3 or 4 days that change the game, certainly as much as what happened on Wednesday.
Yeah, you usually get more change out of discontentment than you do out of when people are kind of happy, right? Apathy is definitely not the breeding ground for change, but discontentment typically is that breeding ground. And I think that was maybe Stephen Harper's nemesis too. I think there's a lot of votes that were against Stephen Harper when he was his last election versus, like for Justin Trudeau at the time. We're
used to kicking people out. You look at the 2001 election, and that was a perfect example of this. It was a massive victory for the BC Liberals, but they never got close to matching that level of support. The next elections were about 44, 43%. It's good. It gives you a majority government, but it's part of the reason why the level of support in a change election becomes prohibitive. We just saw it in Manitoba. Places that have never voted for the NDP went, I don't like what Premier Stephenson is doing. It's been too long with the progressive conservatives. I like what Wab Kinew has done as the leader of the opposition. But that's also part of what makes this more complex for John Rostad. He has been in the legislature as the voice of the BC Conservatives. Is that going to be enough to propel him to defeat David Eby in a debate and to be able to establish that emotional connection with people? Because what we see right now is young people looking for anything. They're not happy with Trudeau. They're not happy with Eby. But how many of them are going to tune into the debate expecting to see Pierre Poilievre and run into John Rostad? There's also that part of confusion that it's a bit of a blessing and a curse. Our name is conservative, and we can get a little bit of lift from what is happening with the brand name. But what's going to happen when people realize that we're not the same?
You do a lot of other polls. We run a lot of stories on your polls as well. So how do you come up with some of the ideas for polls and that? Other than you do other stuff other than just election stuff too?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of curiosity that goes in it. When my career started back in 2007, I always wanted to ask about things that nobody was asking before. And I remember conducting one of the first polls on the monarchy that were conducted in this century because nobody had bothered to ask about it. We asked about marijuana legalization before it was cool in that way. And it's really more about the curiosity of looking into the differences, particularly regional differences, or how ages and genders react to things. There's no shortage of topics that we can tackle. And what I like is it has to be something that is more cohesive. I think there's a lot of ideas out there on let's just ask one question about something and force people into a specific bucket. You got to give people the opportunity to say, I don't know anything about this, or this is how I feel about it, and it's a little bit different. We ask about the death penalty, for instance, and you could look at the question we ask about the death penalty and go, well, Canadians want the death penalty back. And then you get a little bit more into it and they go, well, maybe this isn't the right course of action. I like it as an idea, but it's not something that I would get behind as far as the actual legislative change that it would entail. But it's the only way to understand public opinion. There's several ways to ask things and several ways to feel about something. I don't think you can distill public opinion into one single question. I think the only time we did it was when the Americans were hinting to pay the deficit by giving Montana to Canada and just paying some money for it. Okay, that's one question. Would you like to get Montana? But that's it. That's the only time that we've done a one question release.
So there's sometimes, you'll see polls done by political parties that, like a lot of people say, very biased. And what does that do to your industry? Because, it seems if that's your best interest to get a result, sometimes it would be tougher to people to kind of buy into those results.
I think in the end, it's more expensive to sugarcoat something for a client than it is to tell them the truth. And, I've had that situation repeatedly with people, who come to me for advice and we run some numbers on where they should be candidates. And And I'm very honest with them, and I tell them, look, I know the party's telling you that you're going to win, but we run the numbers, we ask people, and you're going to finish in fourth place. Your name's going to be in Wikipedia for the rest of your life as the person who got 50 votes in this riding. Do you really want to go through with this? It's the best course of action. Be completely honest about the way in which the numbers fall. In the United States, for instance, there's this tendency to have Democratic Party aligned pollsters and Republican Party aligned pollsters. And when I've worked in the U.S., that's the first question I get asked. Are you a Republican or a Democrat? I'm like, no, I'm Canadian. We're trying to bring you an opportunity to look at things differently and to provide an unbiased assessment of things. But that's also part of the complexity to this. People in our industry cannot become cheerleaders for the things they're asking. And if you become a cheerleader, if you buy into what your client wants to do, and it's perfectly fine to feel a specific way about things. But when you let that cloud your judgment, that's when you make mistakes. That's when you write questionnaires that are poorly written. That's when you go to a client and say, 90% of people agree with what we want to do. And then you go through the situation, time passes, and you realize that it wasn't real because you were supposed to have that level of detachment from the thing that you were polling. I think that's the difference. You
brought up the American election. What do you see going? I don't want to take too much of your time. You've been very generous with your time, but just what do you see going on there? Obviously, the polls were in the favor of Trump when Biden was running, but it seems like that the Harris campaign has got a bit of a bump, but then that seems to be waning as well in what I'm seeing in results.
I've done elections in the U.S. since 2012. 2010 we did some gubernatorial and Senate races. But presidential elections in the U.S., you got to look at things the final couple of weeks. Right now everything is window shopping. There's a lot of people who maybe were thinking of voting for Kennedy and are having second thoughts. I'm just glad that we didn't start tracking this before Biden left out because, I would have been very disappointed by, incurring in expenditures for something that wasn't going to take place. I think there's a way for the Democrats to hold on to most of the places where Joe Biden won in 2020, and the Electoral College continues to be the key to this. You could hold on to Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. You could lose Georgia, you could lose Arizona, and you would still have President Kamala Harris. But it depends on what happens in other places. North Carolina, for instance, has been trending Democratic. They couldn't carry it in 2004 when John Edwards was the vice presidential nominee with John Kerry, and he was a local boy. There was talk that if Kennedy's on the ballot in Texas, then the Democrats could sort of come through the middle with 43, 44% of the vote and carry Texas, and that has a massive number of electoral votes. So a lot of things that have happened over the past few weeks changed the composition of the Electoral College, but to me, it's all about rebuilding that blue wall that fell in 2016 when the Democrats chose not to campaign heavily in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
Yeah, and they really rely on polls in the U.S. I mean, they're really play that numbers game, right? So, again,
it's important. You look at without polls, Joe Biden would still be the nominee. And we heard we heard Michelle Obama say when you see a bad poll, work harder, make more phone calls, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends. It's not when you see a bad poll say, oh, they don't know what they're doing, and I'm a walking poll and I knock on doors and I know more than anybody else, because that is the quickest way to end your political career.
Yeah, it just brought a thought to me when I wasn't going to take more of your time, but the Liberals were polling really bad, and I think Justin Trudeau said that they wanted to pick up 10 points, and they went out there with that big push, and they didn't pick up those 10 points, though.
No, it's not happening at this stage. I think there's going to be a lot of discussions about what to do next, and timing is crucial. I think I go back to what happened in 1993. There was a moment when the progressive conservatives were seen as staging the biggest political coup in history. Here comes Kim Campbell and everything is going to be fine. The public reacted well to it in the first early stages and the first few weeks. And then they ended up with only 2 seats. So it's whatever they do, they have to do it with impeccable timing or they won't form the government.
They must be considering a leadership change at some point with the polls in the basement like that, and many candidates worried about their own ridings, right?
Well, and that's also part of it. There's a tendency to look at this also as what is going to happen with my career if I become a member of an opposition party or even a third place party. I think that's partly what happened to Michael Lee in Vancouver-Langara. I'm confident that I can win my seat, but if I'm the only BC United member of the Legislative Assembly, do I really want to go to Victoria for 6 months?
Yeah. Yeah. You've been very generous with your time. How do people find you online? Obviously on X there, you're at your name, Mario_Canseco. What are other places? You got a website, researchco.ca.
Those are the best ones. LinkedIn works as well, but researchco.ca is the best place. We're always doing something. Every week we have something new. It might be Canadian, it might be American, it might be BC based, and we're heading into an interesting time with the U.S. elections, Saskatchewan, BC as well. I have friends in Ontario who say we may go early, and I say please don't do it in October. The calendar is full already.
What do you? How big do you play? Do you think I just had another question. Sorry, the meta blackout will play in the Canadian election. Do you think that'll play in favor of Pierre, or it'll play in favor of Justin?
I think it helps the opposition a little more because there's always a lot of money from the governing party that is spent on online engagement, and when you have a situation like this, you're really forcing people to go somewhere else, and it could be door knocking, it could be flyers, it could be more related to the airwaves. But I think that's also something where the Conservatives have been remarkably superior. You look at the videos produced by Pierre Poilievre, and it started out as something that looked kind of hokey, and now they're doing something that is getting a lot of views and that is really speaking to the younger generation, which is something that Conservatives traditionally in this country were unable to do.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that with the Obama election, right, where he understood the internet better than anybody else. And I think you're seeing that, Pierre kind of has that appeal, and I think he relates to people, and people sense that, right? So, again, I don't want to keep you all day. I could talk to you all day, actually. So I'd love to communicate with you again, especially as we move further into this election. You've been very generous with your time, like I said, and I thank you for that.
It's my pleasure. Anytime. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. Not until November 6th. That's when I'll rest a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's going to be a long day that day, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, hopefully they'll count things quicker because there's not going to be that many mail-in votes. But, I remember going to bed thinking, Pennsylvania, he's down by 4 points. And I had him up by 2, and he ended up winning by 2. So
you've got a couple of really big moments coming up, right? The October moment, and then you got the November moment, right? So, I mean, there's a couple of... And then... We could have a fall federal election as well, and then you'd be really busy, right?
I think that's the expectation. There's going to be a chance to do something like this. I don't see the NDP pulling the plug on the agreement. It's not the same situation that we had in 2011 where Jack Layton suddenly starts to climb the charts after the campaign begins. Yeah. If we had the NDP at 25-26%, it's in their best interest to say, hey, we can form the official opposition and then take it from there. Yeah. But right now they're at 17. There's no point in them to walk away from this.
Yeah, but I guess one of the things, though, is the longer that Jagmeet holds his coalition together, the more of the, I guess, disgruntlement ends up on him as well instead of just Justin Trudeau, right?
Well, I think that is part of it. I think there was an expectation that people would react significantly better to the announcements and the achievements of the deal that they forged in March 2022. And every month we start to see people becoming more disenchanted. So that is also part of the problem. I think they were expecting people to love everything that is happening with this deal. But, Canadians have their own ideas of what pharmacare should be. If I'm not somebody who benefits from this because the medication I require isn't on the list, I'm not going to love this deal.
I think it's that old saying that goes way back. It's the economy, stupid.
James Carville in 1992. It still applies.
There you go. I thank you for your time, and I thank you for watching Kelowna Now.
Thank you.